The Ice Princess by Camilla Lackberg. Part 5. Patrick gave Birgit an apologetic look. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Colgrain, but I have to ask once again. Where were you during the year between spring of 77 and the spring of 78? With desperation in her eyes, Birgit turned to Karl Erik for help. Karl Erik cleared his throat. "We were in Switzerland, Alex, my wife, and I." "Hush, Karl Erik, don't say any more." He ignored her. "We were in Switzerland because our 10-year-old daughter was pregnant. She was exploited, raped." He felt his voice break. Birgit refused to even look at him, but now there was no turning back. "We could tell that something was wrong, but we didn't know what it was. It wasn't until she was in her 4th month that we discovered she was pregnant. We should have seen the signs earlier, but who could believe? We couldn't even imagine." "Karl Erik, please." Birgit's face was like a grey mask, but now the words came pouring forth and he couldn't stop them. "We hushed it all up. We took her out of school, went abroad and stayed there until she gave birth to the child. No one could know anything about it because what would people say? After Alex had the baby, we registered her at the boarding school, returned to Göteborg and got on with our lives." He leaned back in the armchair and gripped the armrests hard. Henrik was the first to speak. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't Alex say anything? I knew she was hiding something from me, but not this." Karl Erik threw out his hands in a resigned gesture. There was nothing he could say to Alex's husband. Patrick fought hard to retain his professionalism, but it was obvious that he was shaken. "Was it—" Patrick hesitated. "Was it Nils Lawrence?" "Who's Nils Lawrence?" asked Henrik. Birgit answered him, with steel in her voice. "He was a teacher at the school. He's the son of Nellie Lawrence." Karl Erik closed his eyes. "We never lodged a complaint. When Alex told us what happened, I stormed up to Nellie's house. I had every intention of reporting him to the police, and I told Nellie as much, but Nellie came and talked with me and suggested that we could solve it without getting the police involved," said Birgit as she sat on the sofa, her back straight as a poker. "She said that there was no reason to humiliate Alex any further by having all of Fjällbacka whispering about what had happened. We could only agree. Nellie also arranged a very well-paid job for me here in Göteborg," said Karl Erik. "We were no better than most people, dazzled by the promise of gold." "How can you say that, Karl Erik? We were only thinking of what was best for Alex. We gave her a chance to move on with her life." "No, Birgit. We gave ourselves a chance to move on with our lives. Alex lost that chance when we decided to hush things up." They gazed at each other across the coffee table. "And the baby?" asked Patrick. "What happened to the baby? Was it given up for adoption?" Silence. Then a voice came from the doorway. "No, the baby was not given up for adoption. They decided to keep the baby and lie to her about who she was." "Julia, I thought you were up in your room." Karl Erik turned to see Julia standing in the doorway. He wondered how long she'd been standing there. She was leaning against the door jamb with her arms crossed. Her entire body radiated spite. Even though it was 4 in the afternoon, she still hadn't changed out of her pajamas. "If it hadn't been for Nellie, or should I say grandmother, you never would have said anything to me, would you? You never would have got round to telling me that my mother is not my mother, but my grandmother, and Papa is not my papa, but my grandfather, and above all that my sister is not my sister, but my mama. Are you following this, or should I go over it one more time? It's a bit complicated." The sarcastic comment was directed at Patrick. It almost looked as if Yulia enjoyed seeing the dismayed expression on his face. Perverse, isn't it? She lowered her voice to a theatrical whisper and put her finger to her lips. But hush. You mustn't tell anyone, because what would people say? Imagine if they started gossiping about the well-to-do Colgrain family. She raised her voice again. But thank goodness Nellie told me everything last summer when I was working at the cannery. She told me what I had a right to know, who I really am. My whole life I felt like an outsider, that I didn't belong in this family. Now I understand why. The bastard child who was born out of rape, and you forced her to be reminded of it every time she looked at me. Do you really not see how cruel that was? Carl Eric flinched at her words as if he'd been slapped. He knew that she was right. Henrik looked as if he could hardly breathe. He leaned his head forward towards his lap and closed his eyes. But Yulia... Birgit reached out her arms to Yulia in an awkward, entreating gesture. Yulia just turned her back to her in contempt, and they heard her stamping up the stairs. I'm really sorry, said Patrick, throwing out his hands in a gesture of resignation. I knew that something wasn't right, but I never would have imagined this. I don't know what to say. We don't know what to say ourselves, especially to each other. Carl Eric looked at his wife. How long did the abuse go on, do you know? Probably at least a couple of months, maybe up to a year. He hesitated. And there you have the answer to your earlier question. Which one do you mean? Said Patrick. The one about the connection between Alex and Anders. Anders was also a victim. The day before we were going to move, we found a note that Alex had written to Anders. It seems that he too had been molested by Nils. Obviously they had understood somehow, or found out, that they were both in the same situation, and they turned to each other for comfort. I took the note over to Vera Nilsson. I told her what had happened to Alex, and probably what had happened to Anders. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Anders is, or was, he corrected himself quickly, all she had. I suppose I hoped that Vera would be able to do what we weren't brave enough to do. Report Nils and hold him responsible for what he had done. But nothing happened, so I assumed that Vera felt just as weak as we did. And you have no idea where Nils went? No. No idea. But wherever he is, I hope he's suffering. That devil. Patrick drove slowly from Selvik down towards the centre of town. He parked the car in the lot by Eva's Foods and walked the rest of the way. Vera opened the door almost immediately. She gave him a questioning look, but stepped aside when he asked to come in. She preceded him into the kitchen, and they sat down at the kitchen table. He saw dark circles under her eyes, a sign of her grief after her son's death. On the table lay an old photo album, and he guessed that if he opened it, he'd see pictures of Anders from his childhood. It was hard for him to come here, to visit a mother who was grieving for a son who had only been dead a few days. Patrick spoke slowly and clearly, as if to a child. We've investigated Anders's death as a murder, and we've also searched for a connection with the murder of Alexandra Wietner, a woman with whom we know he had a relationship. But then I found this at Anders's flat, this notepad. When he pressed the pen into the paper, it also left an impression on the sheet underneath. That's how we were able to retrieve the message. She fingered the paper for a moment. I saw him at once. I felt like my heart stopped that instant. You've read the letter, you know what it says. That he couldn't go on living, that life was one long torment for him, and now he couldn't fight it anymore. Must have sat there in the kitchen for an hour, maybe two, I don't really know. Her gaze was steady, but Patrick could see from her trembling hands that her outward calm was a sham. But why, Vera? You're too young to understand. The contempt for suicides still sits deep in people here in the coastal regions. I didn't want people to talk like that about my little boy. They've talked enough rubbish about him over the years. There was a touch of steel in Vera's voice. For all these years she had devoted herself to protecting and helping her son, and although Patrick still didn't understand her motive, it was perhaps only natural that she continued to protect him even after his death. I spoke with Alex's parents, Patrick said, who made certain claims about Nils Lawrence. According to them, Nils Lawrence sexually assaulted Alex, and they claimed that Anders was also abused. Vera sat ramrod stiff on the edge of the kitchen chair. After a moment of internal struggle, she slowly got up. I don't want to talk about ancient history. I want you to go now. If you want to charge me for what I did when I found Anders, then you know where to find me. But I don't intend to help you root about in things that would be best left buried. Just one question. Did you ever talk to Alexandra about this? Yes, I did. I sat there in her house about a week before she died, listening to her naive ideas about coming to terms with the past. Modern drivel, in my opinion. Some things should remain private. I told her that as well. I don't know whether she listened to me, but I hope so. Otherwise, I only had a stubborn bladder infection to show for the trouble of sitting there in her freezing house. And with that, Vera signalled that the discussion was over and walked towards the front door. She opened it for Patrick and said a very guarded farewell. Patrick found himself standing out in the cold again, with his cap pulled down over his ears. He headed briskly for his car. An idea was slowly forming. It was only a small detail, but it might be important. Lackberg didn't speak until he had lit his pipe and puffed a couple of times. I always used to go there on Fridays to check on everything before she arrived in the evening. So the last time I was there was the Friday before that. No, actually, we had to go to our youngest son's 40th birthday party on Friday, so I went on the Thursday evening instead. How was the house then? Did you notice anything unusual? Aylett puffed slowly on his pipe as he thought. No, everything was fine. I did a round through the house and the cellar, but everything looked good. I locked the house carefully when I left, as always. She'd given me my own key. And the furnace, was it working? Was there heat in the house? Oh, yeah, certainly. There was nothing wrong with the furnace then. Must have gone out sometime after I was there. I don't understand what importance that has. Aylett temporarily took the pipe out of his mouth. To be quite honest, I don't know if it is important, but thank you for your help. Aylett began collecting the coffee cups and plates, as his wife Svea accompanied Patrick to the front door under a constant stream of words. He heaved a sigh of relief when the door closed behind him. What a frightful woman. But he had got the confirmation he wanted. Now he was quite sure that he knew who had murdered Alex Wittmer. The ceremony at Anders's funeral had been short and dreary. With her head bowed, Vera walked slowly up the gravel path towards the church. The cold wind was whipping hard, and she had tied her scarf like a kerchief over her head. For a second Patrick hesitated, then hurried to catch up with her. Lovely ceremony. She smiled bitterly. You know as well as I do that Anders's funeral was just as pathetic as most of his life. But thanks anyway. They walked slowly in the direction of Vera's home, which was only a couple of 100 yards from the church. Nonchalantly, Patrick said, "What I think is most tragic about this whole story is that a child also had to die." Vera turned towards him. She stopped and grabbed hold of his sleeve. "What child? What are you talking about?" Alexandra's child. She was pregnant when she was murdered, in her 3rd month. Her husband, Vera stammered, but Patrick continued with forced coldness. Her husband had nothing to do with it. No, the father seemed to be someone she used to meet here in Fjällbacka. Vera was holding so hard onto his sleeve that her knuckles turned white. Good Lord. Good Lord. Yes, it's certainly cruel to kill an unborn child. According to the autopsy report, it was apparently a little boy. They were standing under the big chestnut tree, 50 yards from Vera's house. She suddenly exploded into motion, running surprisingly fast for her age, and it took a couple of seconds for Patrick to recover from the shock and run after her. When he reached her house, the front door was wide open, and he cautiously stepped inside. She was pale, and for the first time he saw tears, a glitter in the corner of her eye. Vera sat down stiffly on one of the kitchen chairs. So, I murdered my grandson. In time she would find out the truth, but first it was Patrick's turn. You lied about being there the week before Alex died. You said that you sat in her cold house freezing, but the furnace didn't break until the week after that, the week she died. Vera was staring into space, and it seemed that she didn't even hear what Patrick had said. It's strange. It's only now that I actually realised that I took another person's life. Alexandra's death was never very real to me. But Anders's child... Why did Alex have to die? Vera held up her hand. I didn't know that my silence would eat him away inside and strip him of everything of value. I kept quiet for all those years, but each year robbed Anders of more than the one before. We never talked about it, not even inside these 4 walls, and only now do I understand what it must have done to him. For a second the facade looked as if it might crack. Over the years we found a sort of equilibrium. Then Anders told me that Alex wanted to expose what had happened to them. She wanted to clean all the old skeletons out of the closet, I think that's what he said. It felt like an electric shock. That would change everything. Nothing would be the same if Alex dragged up old secrets after so many years. What good would it do, and what would people say? So you went to visit her? Yes. I went there that Friday evening hoping to talk some sense into her. Make her understand that she couldn't single-handedly make a decision that would affect us all. But she didn't understand? Vera gave a bitter smile. No, she didn't. I tried to appeal to her. I explained to her how difficult it would be for Anders if she made public what had happened. But she looked me straight in the eye and claimed I was only thinking of myself, not Anders. Can you imagine such cheek? The rage that a moment before had been ignited in Vera's eyes was extinguished just as quickly as it had appeared, and was replaced by an indifferent, dead look. She continued in a monotone. Something burst inside me when I heard her make such an outrageous claim, when I had done everything with Anders's best interests at heart. I could almost hear a click in my head, and I simply acted without thinking. I had my sleeping pills with me in my purse, and when she went into the kitchen I crumbled a few tablets into her cider glass. I hadn't really thought out what I should do next. I got the idea that I would make it look like a suicide. Her voice was toneless. It sounded as if she were relating a completely normal, everyday event, not a murder. I had to drag her into the bathroom and maneuver her into the tub. I washed off the glass I drank out of, turned off the lights, locked the door, and put the spare key back in its place. Patrick forced his voice to remain calm. You understand that you'll have to come with me now, don't you? May I just gather up a few things to take with me? In the doorway, she turned round. How was I to know she was pregnant? It was impossible for me to know, don't you think? Patrick could only nod mutely. In time he would tell her that the child wasn't Anders's, but for the time being, he didn't want to disturb the balance of trust they had established. There were several more people she would have to tell her story to before they could close the case on Alexandra Vitna for good. I can't believe that Vera would murder Alex so that she wouldn't talk about assaults against her and Anders that took place over 25 years ago. Erika swirled her wineglass meditatively. You should never underestimate the need to not make waves in a small town, said Patrick. I think it was the shame that she couldn't bear. How is she taking it now? Now that she's been exposed, I mean. She's surprisingly calm. I think she was immensely relieved when we told her that Anders wasn't the father of the child, and so she hadn't murdered her unborn grandchild after all. Now she doesn't seem to care what happens to her. And why should she? Her son is dead. She has no friends, no life. Everything has been uncovered and she has nothing more to lose. Only her freedom, and that doesn't mean much to her right now. They were sitting in Patrick's flat, sharing a bottle of wine after having dinner together. Erika closed her eyes. The moment was wonderful and frightening at the same time. Everything was so perfect, and yet she couldn't help thinking that this might mean it would all be downhill from here. She didn't even want to think about what would happen if she moved back to Stockholm. And are you the big hero at the station now? The deep sigh from Patrick indicated that this was not the case. No, you don't think Mellberg would give credit where credit was due, do you? But what the heck? Who wants to see their name in print anyway? I arrested a murderer yesterday, and that's good enough for me. When he left home, Erika was still in bed. He drove towards Fjällbacka and turned off at the sign that said Vedda before parking in the lot. His was the only car there. After 10 minutes, another car parked beside his. The driver stepped out, opened the passenger door of Patrick's car, and got in. Patrick left his car idling so he could leave the heater on. It seems rather exciting, meeting in secret like this under the cover of darkness. My only question is why? Jan Lawrence was completely relaxed. I thought the investigation was over. You have Alex's murderer, don't you? Yes, that's true. But there are still a few pieces that don't really fit. I see. What exactly doesn't fit? Jan's face betrayed no emotions. As you may have heard, Alexandra and Anders were molested by your stepbrother Nils. Yes, I heard that. Terrible. Especially for Mother's sake. And how do you feel about it? About the fact that your brother was a paedophile, and that your mother knew about it and protected him? Jan brushed off some invisible flecks of dust on his lapel. I have a theory, you see, Patrick went on. How thrilling. I don't think Nils molested only Alex and Anders. I think that his primary victim was someone he had within close reach. I think that you were molested as well. For the first time, Patrick thought he saw a crack in Jan's shiny, polished exterior. I found a common link, he said, between the three of you, in your childhood. I saw the little leather patch in your office when I visited you. Anders and Alex saved theirs as well. On the back of all of them there's a smudged fingerprint in blood. Then 3 letters were burned onto the front of the patch. TTM. I haven't managed to decipher that. Perhaps you could help me out on that point. He decided to try to facilitate Jan's decision. Everything we say here today will remain between us. I have neither the energy nor the resources to follow up on something that happened 25 years ago. Then I hardly think I could find any proof if I tried. This is for me, personally. I have to know. The temptation was too great for Jan. The Three Musketeers. That's what TTM stands for. We made a pact. With a piece of broken glass, we each made a cut in one finger and mixed our blood, and then stamped the emblems with it. I was the strongest of the three of us. I was forced to be the strongest. Jan lit a cigarette, rolled down the window a crack to let out the smoke, and went on. I was the one who decided that we should solve the problem in our own way. There was no other way out. It was as if a dam had burst. Jan talked at a furious pace. One cold, clear winter day we went out on the ice, my foster brother and I. I had spent many hours on the ice that winter and knew precisely where to take him. Anders and Alex were waiting there. Nils was surprised when he saw them, but he was so arrogant that he never saw us as a threat. We were only kids, after all. The rest was easy. A hole in the ice, a shove, and then he was gone. Do you think that Vera found out as well? I'm completely convinced of it. I don't think that Anders would have been able to keep something like that from Vera all those years. Patrick was thinking out loud. So, presumably Vera murdered Alex not only to keep her quiet about the assaults, but because she was afraid that Anders would be indicted for murder. Did you stay in contact afterwards, you and Alex and Anders? No. Alex moved away almost immediately, and Anders retreated into his own little world. Of course, we did see each other occasionally, but we hadn't spoken to each other in 25 years until Anders rang me after Alex's death, screaming and yelling that I was the one who had murdered her. Didn't you know that she had thought about going to the police and telling them about Nils's death? Not before she died, no. Anders told me that afterwards. Jan nonchalantly blew some smoke rings in the car. What would have happened if you had? I suppose we'll never know, will we? He turned to Patrick and regarded him with his cold blue eyes. Patrick shuddered. No, they would never know. Alex Tregear was reading The Ice Princess by Camilla Lackberg. The translator was Stephen T. Murray. The Ice Princess was abridged for radio by Alison Joseph and produced by Gemma Jenkins.